Okay, it's an absolutely great pleasure to be here in the lovely city of Kyoto and at this absolutely fascinating meeting. I'm an evolutionary biologist, and evolutionary biologists just love diversity. We love to document diversity, whether it's in beetles, butterflies, or in this case, birds. And there's a long tradition in evolutionary biology of how we study this diversity. And prior to the Darwinian revolution, very influential people, and you can see here a picture of Geoffrey Saint-Hilaire, was fascinated by this diversity, but thought that underlying this diversity could be determined, could be discovered if we peeled away the superficial similarities, some deeper universal laws of composition or laws of form that reflected the kind of plan of a creator. This was the sort of formalist schools of kind of classical morphology. You can see him saying here that, despite an infinity of distinct arrangements, this diversity is limited, it's constrained in certain ways. And Saint-Hilaire thought it was constrained by these underlying universal laws of form, sort of snowflake principles, if you like. Now, the most fundamental epistemological break in the Darwinian revolution was to realise that this diversity was not some superficial similarity to be stripped away to get at the real kind of underlying essence. This variation was the signal rather than the noise. As Dick Lewontin says here, before Darwin, the central issue for science was to discover the platonic form that lay beneath the imperfect reality. Darwin revolutionised our understanding of nature by taking the actual variation among actual things as the central to reality, not as an annoying and irrelevant disturbance to be wished away. So one of the key distinctive features of the Darwinian revolution is this idea that variation really matters. Variation is the key. And a second component of it was that history also matters. The way in which to understand this variation is to understand its history. And so what Darwin did was to take Owen's and Saint-Hilaire's unity of type and explain them not it's due to some underlying kind of platonic form or some snowflake kind of principle, but instead due to descent with modification. Darwin says, on my theory, unity of type is explained by unity of descent. So we have variation. The way to make sense of it is to understand its history. And here you can see variation in Hawaiian honeycreepers and a recent Bayesian phylogeny showing their descent with modification. So my talk, it's really these two themes, these two Darwinian themes that I'm going to be emphasising. That variation, language variation, is really critically important, and we have tools from evolutionary biology that enable us to understand its history. So that'll be the first two parts of my talk. And in the final part of the talk, what I'm going to do is contrast two different accounts of the evolution of language. I'm going to emphasise that one of them is much more in line with the way in which evolutionary biologists explain novelty today. Okay, so to the first point about variation. There are about 7,000 different languages spoken today, some with just 10 contrastive sounds, some with over 100. Some with verbs at the beginning of the sentence, some with verbs in the middle, and some with verbs at the end. Understanding the constraints on this variation is perhaps one of the central tasks of linguistics. And what I want to give you is three somewhat caricatured accounts of the causes or the arguments for the major constraints on linguistic variation. Under one account, associated with Chomsky and the generative school of linguistics, there are strong constraints on language variation imposed by the innate structure of the human mind. Perhaps in a principles and parameters account, these are kind of locked in a rigid kind of way. Joseph Greenberg, in contrast, while emphasising constraint on language, and in particular constraints on linguistic topology, saw these as not as rigid as Chomsky, but rather more statistical generalities. And my kind of third type specimen here is Stephen Levinson, who has argued that rather than putative universals reflecting universal features of the human mind, these are rather due to culture rather than innate cognition. That culture trumps cognition when it comes to constraints on language variation. I want to focus just on one paradigmatic account of constraints on variation. And this is arguments, debates about what constrains variation in word order. So, there are some kind of Greenberg generalizations about constraints on word order. Greenberg said that languages with a dominant VSO, verb, subject, object order, are always prepositional. So, put man, dog in canoe. Whereas languages with a normal SVO order are normally post-positional. Man, dog, put, canoe, in. And this, Greenberg claimed, was a strong statistical tendency in languages all around the world. Now, Chomsky, in the past at least, cited these generalizations from Greenberg in the following way. He said in 1998, there has also been a very productive study of generalizations that are more directly observable. Chomsky would see these things, if you like, as kind of superficial representations of underlying kind of universal grammar. So he says there has also been very productive study of generalizations more directly observable. Generalizations about word orders, for example. The work of Joseph Greenberg has been particularly instructive and influential in this regard. And he then goes on to say, these universals are probably descriptive generalizations that should be derived from principles of universal grammar. And here you can see Baker's account in an attempt to use a principles and parameters type model to account for these descriptive generalizations in word order. Now, as evolutionary biologists, we might say, well, that's a really interesting theory. What's the evidence? How strong is the evidence for it? We might go out and look at the actual diversity, and the way we look at the diversity of beetles and kind of butterflies. But, and this is absolutely puzzling to me as an evolutionary biologist, generative linguists have not been particularly interested in doing that. Chomsky says, I have not hesitated to propose a general principle of linguistic structure on the basis of a single language. So it's absolutely puzzling to me how kind of introspection could be sufficient to make arguments. Evolutionary biology is grounded on the study of variation. So, what do we know about the actual variation in word order? Well, here is some data taken from the World Atlas of Language Structures, and the way it's pictured is that if languages have object before the verb, there is an outer blue circle. And if languages have postpositions, there is an inner blue circle. So the extent that these statistical generalizations are true, languages that have an outer blue circle should also have an inner blue circle. And vice versa. Languages with an outer red circle that have the verb before the object should also have prepositions. And if you look at this, it looks pretty compelling. You can see that there does appear to be this general statistical association. But there's a problem that was first diagnosed by Darwin's cousin, Galton. And that is that this variation has a history. It's not the case that all the languages of the world go back independently to a single common ancestor. Instead, they're related through these nested patterns of descent. Just as there's a tree of life, there's also a family tree of languages. And one of the problems that confronts linguistic topologists is, therefore, that you can't treat individual languages as statistically independent. Moreover, what you can't do is, say, sample from separate families and the hope that that will get you statistical independence, because there can be deeper patterns of inheritance that you might be unaware of. So what's needed, what the solution to Galton's problem is to analyse this history in terms of phylogenetic trees. That's the solution used by evolutionary biologists today. What we want to infer is the actual changes, the actual independent events on these phylogenetic trees. So, and this is what I'm going to emphasise, that one of the things that evolutionary biologists can give to the study of language is a way of analysing variation through the use of phylogenies. So, expressed in kind of phylogenetic terms, what we have here in these claims about word order functional dependencies is a hypothesis about correlated trait evolution. And here you can see a family tree, a language family tree, say, with two traits mapped on it, and they have two different states. And you can see in this family tree, the evolution of those traits doesn't appear to be correlated. There'd be no evidence of functional dependencies between those traits. Whereas in this family tree, the evolution of the traits does appear to be correlated. At the ancestral state, you have a red square and a red circle. At this point on the tree, there's a change, a co-evolutionary change from red square to blue square, and from red circle to red circle to blue circle. So you have a statistical coupling of traits on that tree. And what evolutionary biologists use today is complex stochastic models to test whether traits are significantly coupled on these evolutionary trees. I'm not really going to go into the kind of technicalities, but what we do is fit on an estimate of language phylogenies two kind of models. One model where the evolution of these traits is modelled as independent, and another model where we estimate a larger rate matrix where the evolutionary changes are coupled. And if the account of functional dependencies in language is correct, what we'd expect is that this model would fit significantly better than that model. The dependent model would fit better than the independent model. And we can use Bayes factors to quantify the difference in fit between those models. So that is the project exactly that Michael Dunn, Simon Greenhill, Stephen Levinson and myself set about doing. Testing these claims about functional dependencies in word order using the methods of modern evolutionary biology. And what we did was to take data from 4 major language families spanning right across the world, from the Bantu languages in Africa to Indo-European languages to Austronesian languages to Uto-Aztecan languages. So the first thing we did was to construct from basic vocabulary language family trees using Bayesian phylogenetic methods. And then we would fit this word order data, testing a dependent model versus an independent model, to really see if there was strong functional dependencies between these traits. And if the Greenberg account is correct, there should be statistical dependencies between these different aspects of word order. A slight modification due to Matthew Dreyer of the Greenberg account would suggest that it's only in this more limited set that we should find statistical dependencies between these different features of word order. So what did we find? Were there very strong, rigid-like, locked-in functional dependencies of the kind that would be predicted by Chomsky? Were the weaker statistical tendencies of the kind generally predicted by Greenberg, or perhaps more narrowly predicted by Dreyer? Well, what did we find? What I'm showing here, say in Austronesian, is connections where we found strong functional dependencies. And the thickness of these lines is proportional to the Bayes factor, showing support for the dependent model over the independent model. And so you can see, as predicted by the kind of Greenberg account, strong functional dependencies between object and verb and adposition in noun. And that dependency is also found in the Indo-European languages, but it's not found in the Uto-Aztecan languages. And if you look across these 4 different language families, what you can see is that the patterns of dependencies are not all the same. There are some commonalities, but strikingly, there are strong kind of differences. So far from being kind of universal, what these dependencies are lineage-specific constraints. So yes, there are functional dependencies in language, but they're lineage-specific. And there's even specificity in the pathways. So in both Austronesian and Indo-European, we found functional dependencies between verb-object order and prepositions or postpositions, but the actual transitions, the actual evolutionary pathways were different in those two particular cases. So what do we conclude from this? What we concluded was that there was no evidence for a sort of principles and parameters type account, no strong locked-in functional dependencies between language, and not even weaker, more general statistical universals of the kind predicted by Greenberg. Instead, what we found is these lineage-specific traits. In Stephen Levinson's term, what he said is that culture trumps cognition, at least when it comes to word order universals. I would not quite go so far. I think there's a role to play for cognitive factors in biasing cultural evolution in particular directions. But minimally, what this shows is that if this is the best evidence for kind of universal grammar or principles and parameters or general strong constraints imposed by the innate structure of the human mind, it isn't very compelling. What we find instead is local cultural differences. And by culture, what you mean is not kind of terms for ice or something like that, but instead particular kind of linguistic processes that are lineage specific. For example, in Austronesian languages, it's typical that adpositions have their origins in kind of verbs. So those local linguistic processes, those local historical factors in cultural evolution, seem to be constraining the patterns that we see. Okay, so the message, the kind of Darwinian message so far, is that variation matters and that we can analyse it using computational methods from evolutionary biology and to test hypotheses about putative universals in language. Now, generative linguists have frequently kind of looked down their nose, really, at kind of historical linguistics. They tend to see it as the sort of poor cousin in linguistics, the kind of stuck with the rather boring stuff of all those particular cases, while they have the kind of grand formalisms. Well, from the point of view of an evolutionary biologist, this is a bit puzzling, because evolutionary biologists find historical explanations absolutely fascinating and absolutely compelling. So in this next section of the talk, what I want to do is show just how compelling and how interesting, really, it can be to look at language kind of history. Imagine you were going on a holiday in the Pacific, and you wanted to do a bit of preparation. You might look at terms for 5 in different Pacific languages, and you would see here in Maori, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the term is rima, and in Fijian it's lima, and in Samoan it's lima, and in Hawaiian, way over here, it's rima, and way up there it's rima, and in Rapa Nui, Easter Island, it's rima. And you might think, well, this is kind of puzzling. I wonder what kind of process could have produced these similarities. And you might look a bit further afield in the Solomons and Micronesia and islands around New Guinea and Indonesia, all the way across off the screen here to Madagascar, up into the Philippines and into Taiwan, and you'd find even more widespread these striking similarities. And the conclusion you might draw, as the early European explorers did, is that these similarities couldn't have arisen due to chance. They must reflect descent from a common ancestor. These similarities are homology. They reflect a common evolutionary origin. And indeed they do, because all the languages that I showed there are part of perhaps the world's largest language family, the Austronesian language family, a family of about 1,200 languages. And there's been rather polemical debates about the history of this language family and the peopling of the Pacific. Under one account, coming mainly from archaeologists and linguists, people have proposed that the Austronesian languages started in Taiwan about 5,500 years ago. There was a pause before they spread into the Philippines, and then they spread rapidly through Borneo, Sulawesi, and Indonesia, along the New Guinea coast, out into remote Oceania, where there was a pause before the settlement of the most remote parts of the Pacific. That's a kind of pause account of the settlement of the Pacific. based on linguistics and archaeology. And that account is strongly contested, in particular by geneticists. Geneticists have argued on the dating of mitochondrial lineages that the Austronesians didn't come from Taiwan. Instead, they came from an area here that Stephen Oppenheimer calls Wallacea. And rather than spreading in one long chained migration, they spread in this two-pronged kind of way. And rather than originating about 5,500 years ago, they originated between 13 and 17,000 years ago, because that's what the dating of the mitochondrial haplotype showed them. So, I guess from my point of view as an evolutionary biologist, here's two hypotheses. How can we test them? Well, they make three rather different predictions. They differ in where they predict that the root of any language family tree would be. Under the pulse-pause model, it's sort of out of Taiwan model. Therefore, the basal lineages should be in Taiwan. And a tree, if you were to build a language family tree, should show a long branching structure. Whereas in the sort of Slowboat or Wallacean model, there should be a two-pronged topology. They differ in the age that would be predicted for Austronesian. Under the pulse-pause model, the age of this language family should be about 5,500 years versus 13 to 17,000 years. And really critically, they differ. I mean, the pulse-pause model is really specific. It predicts that if we were to build a big language family tree for Austronesian languages, there would be two branches, just two branches out of all the branches, that would be really long, corresponding to where there's evidence, archaeological evidence for long pauses in the migration. So, what do we do? Well, Simon Greenhill and myself went and visited this chap here. This is a historical linguist in their native habitat. No kind of formal branching diagrams to be found here. Instead, you can see Bob Blust surrounded by word lists, as kind of field notes and things. And what we did was to take these word lists and convert them into a web-accessible database, a kind of lexical gene bank, if you like. And we now have basic vocabulary data for over 900 different Austronesian languages spanning throughout the range of Austronesia. But to use the kind of computational methods from evolutionary biology, we needed a way of coding that lexical information. So what we did was to draw on this wonderful group of linguists to get their assistance to what is called cognate coding. And that is to diagnose the homologies in these items of basic vocabulary. And if you want to know what cognates are, they aren't just words that look alike. They're words that show systematic correspondences, systematic sound correspondences that indicate that they're genuine homologies. So here I've just sort of colour-coded two different cognate sets for the term for father. So what we ended up with is a kind of binary matrix, a matrix of languages by binarily coded cognate sets. And we selected 400 of the best attested of these languages. We used some outgroups to help us root the tree. So we ended up with a data matrix for these languages, a bit like a kind of genetic data matrix, a matrix of 400 languages with over 34,000 cognate sets. And then what we did, I'm going to explain this rather quickly, is to use Bayesian phylogenetic methods to estimate the set of a good set of trees, the set of the posterior distribution of trees. And briefly what this does is take the data, take a stochastic model of the gains and losses in these cognate sets. There are some priors on tree shape and branch lengths. And then what we do is search through tree space. Now the space of possible trees is truly vast. For just 10 languages, there's 34 million possible trees. For the 400 languages that we were looking at, there's more possible ways of relating them in a tree than there are atoms in the universe. So this is an enormously computationally intensive task. So what we're going to end up with is not a single best tree, but a set of trees sampled in proportion to their posterior probability. So we ran that analysis on the cluster. It took about 15 years of CPU time. And what we did was to produce, at the end of the analysis, a set of trees sampled in proportion to their posterior probability. So this is shown as a sort of cloud of trees rather than a single tree. And we used that trees to test those three hypotheses. The first hypothesis was about what should be the basal lineages of the language trees. And what you can see, and this is just a sort of visual summary of our language trees, is as predicted by the out of Taiwan model, all the basal lineages in our trees were the languages in Taiwan. So sort of strike one for the kind of pause model. We also found this long chaining topology showing this migration expansion. What about the dating of this tree? Now, languages don't change at a constant rate. There is no exact kind of glotto clock, just as there is no exact kind of molecular clock. But we can use some calibrations and some rate smoothing algorithms to date those kind of lineages. I'm not going to go into any of these in detail, but other than to say one of them, of the calibrations we used, is the presence of these dentate stamped pottery, so-called Lapita pottery, that shows up abruptly in the archaeological record about 3,200 years ago. And that's been associated with just the oceanic languages. So we could use that as a constraint to date our language trees. What do we find about the age of Austronesian? Well, if the Slovak model is correct, the age of the Austronesian language family should be between 13,000 and 17,000 years. If the pause model is correct, it should be around about 5,500 years. And here you can see the distribution of our estimates for the age of Austronesian. You can see that systematically it fits pretty well perfectly where would be predicted on the basis of the archaeology. And we did various things to estimate, to see how robust that inference was, and it's extremely robust. Well, what about those really precise predictions that in the record of the lexicon, of our basic vocabulary, there'll be this signal of these pulses and pauses in the settlement of the Pacific? Well, what we found is here's a kind of summary tree for Austronesian languages. Here are the Taiwanese languages at the base. And what you can see is a long pause, a long branch in this dated tree when the languages went from Taiwan to the Philippines. So exactly where was predicted by the archaeology, here is this long branch in the tree. And then you can see this incredibly rapid expansion pulse as people went about the 7,000 kilometres from the Philippines out into kind of Polynesia. And then another long pause for the settlement of the most remote parts of the Pacific. What I would argue is, not only can these computational methods from evolutionary biology give us insight into a particular historical case, they can give us insight into the question of, why is there so much diversity in languages? What are the kind of things that are underlying these patterns of diversification? And in this case, it turns out that we can reconstruct terms for double-hull canoes only back to this branch on the Austronesian tree. So the suggestion is that it was the invention of double-hulled canoes that enabled the rapid expansion of these Pacific peoples. And perhaps the invention of these large double-hulled canoes, these are sort of simple outriggers, these are large double-hulled canoes that could take lots of food and lots of people, that enabled the settlements of the most remote parts of the Pacific. Okay, so what I've been emphasising is that variation matters, and we can make sense of variation through understanding its history. And we can understand its history by using computational methods derived from evolutionary biology. So this can give us insights both into putative claims about functional dependencies in language, but also in terms of the patterns of language diversification. In the final part of my talk, I want to contrast two accounts of the origin of language, or the language faculty. And this has been described by Christensen and Kirby as perhaps the hardest problem in science. And certainly in contrast to the kind of tractability of analysing the sort of cultural evolution of language, this is indeed a really hard problem. Here is Chomsky's account of how this faculty, maybe in a narrow sense, maybe in a slightly broader sense, evolved. Chomsky in 2010 said, perhaps language, was a side effect of increased brain size, or perhaps some chance mutation. With some small group from which we are all descended, a rewiring of the brain took place in some individual, call him Prometheus, yielding the operation of unbounded merge, applying to concepts with intricate and little understood properties. Prometheus had many advantages, capacities for complex thought, planning, interpretation, and so on. And Chomsky goes on to say that this is what kind of powered the sort of cultural Big Bang, the kind of great leap kind of forward. He suggests that this, perhaps a chance mutation, occurred somewhere between 100,000 years to 50,000 years ago. And he suggests that it's not the product, the fixation of this was not the product of natural selection, because he's talking about I language, a sort of interior language of thought, which is, kind of occurs prior to externalization. So in this account, we have a chance mutation, which isn't initially kind of useful. Selection doesn't explain its kind of spread. It gives rise to the Big Bang. Now, as an evolutionary biologist, that just sounds like a miracle to me. But it's increasingly emphasized in the kind of biolinguistics program. Maybe this can be cashed out in more materialistic terms. Maybe, although it appears a bit theological, maybe there's some rationale in evolutionary biology for this. Maybe this can be grounded in our understanding of kind of Hox genes. So I thought I'd give an example of kind of evo-devo in action and see if the kind of inference scheme, the pattern of argumentation that's used by Chomsky actually fits the pattern of argumentation that's used by evo-devo evolutionary biologists today. So I want to talk about the evolution of feathers. Feathers are a magnificent organ, an enormously complex, intricate organ, perhaps almost as complex as is language. Look at them, they're beautiful, perfect. And it used to be thought that they somehow miraculously evolved from scales. And that was kind of odd, because why would you take a solid structure, fragment it apart, and then kind of join it back together? It seemed a rather peculiar evolutionary route. But recently, we've come to get a rather different understanding of the evolutionary origin of feathers. And this work comes from the beautiful work of Prum and Bush. And what they argue is that feathers don't originate as scales, as fish scales. Instead, they originate from protrusions in the epidermis. And they have a kind of developmental model for the development of feather structures. Basically, there's a kind of protrusion in the epidermis. You get vertical layers formed. These fuse to form a kind of rachis, and then that can be opened up to form the kind of barbs of kind of feathers, and barbules added at a later stage. And that was just a kind of speculative initial kind of developmental model. More recently, that's been underpinned by our understanding of how particular genes actually produce those changes. It turns out just two genes involved, BMP2, bone morphogenetic protein, that regulates and promotes differentiation, and the sonic hedgehog gene, which promotes proliferation. And basically, they can model the differential expression of these genes and show how it can produce feather-like structures. And one of the really striking things about this kind of model is that it predicted some kind of intermediate stages of feathers that had not been observed. So here we have an account based on particular genes, not feather-specific genes, not even feather-specific in the narrow sense genes. These are kind of much more domain-general genes that have been co-opted to produce these proto-feather-like structures. And one of the kind of spectacular successes of this model is that although these intermediate stages weren't known when Prum and Bush proposed their initial model, subsequent fossil finds in China have indeed found fossils of dinosaur-like creatures that possess these intermediate forms predicted by this kind of developmental model. So that's one of the sort of paradigmatic examples of evo-devo in action. And I just want to contrast that with Chomsky's account. First of all, it involves known genes. It's not, postulating something that isn't known. And these genes don't have feather-specific functions. They're much more domain-general in their abilities. Secondly, it's not proposing, it's the mechanisms that are involved are co-opted from much more general things. And this is what we're increasingly finding about the evolution of morphological novelty. Rather than things being created de novo, Instead, the way in which evolutionary biologists typically explain major evolutionary innovations is by the co-opting, the acceptation of existing structures and their incremental modification. One of the really good things about this kind of scheme is incremental, the step-by-step nature, where the design of these feathers incrementally builds on the development and the evolution of the previous steps. Thirdly, notice there is actually some devo here. There is a developmental model underlying how you go from kind of genes through to kind of morphology. Nothing like that appears in the kind of speculations of the kind of biolinguistic program. And finally, notice that this theory really puts its neck on the line. It makes some predictions. And I'm unaware of any predictions that might arise from postulating just some chance mutation that arose between 50 and 100,000 years ago. So what I'm emphasising is there's a huge gulf between the way in which actual evolutionary biologists carry out kind of evo-devo and the kind of armchair speculations about evo-devo and the biolinguistic program. I want to contrast Chomsky's account of the origins of language with an alternative account, which I think is far from perfect, frankly, but I think is much more in line with the way in which evolutionary biologists argue about the origins of major novelty. And the kind of account I'll be arguing for is a kind of double hand-to-mouth account. Many people have argued that the origins of human language should be found not in 8 vocalizations, but instead in terms of gesture. These people include like, the 4 M's, really. Michael R. Beebe, Mike Corbelis, Merlin Donald, and Mike Tomasello. Here you can see my colleague, Mike Corbelis, communing with his distant kind of relatives. And what they argue is that gesture is a much more plausible incremental kind of origin for the evolution of language, because 8 vocalizations are not homologous with human vocalizations. They're not under voluntary control, and they're not typically learnt. They reflect emotional kind of states. So they argue, this is a kind of rather rapid summary, that there are at least 4 good reasons for believing in a sort of gesture-first account. One, the gesture is a much more plausible model than vocalizations because it's his ability to be under voluntary control and to be learned. Secondly, because of the existence of the mirror neuron system that enables a mirroring between kind of action and visualizing action. Thirdly, because sign languages have many of the kind of properties of true languages. And fourthly, because there's lateralization, both in terms of gesture and manual action, and also in terms of language. I take it that these arguments are fairly familiar to most people here. But there's 2 problems with a kind of gesture first, but gesture only account for the origin of language. The 2 problems, at least 2 problems, are one, how to explain the origins of sort of stimulus-independent signs, and secondly, how to explain the origins of syntax. As we heard the other day, everything bows to syntax. Thank you. So, what I'm going to suggest is that one of the things that evolutionary biologists look is not how single genes produce effects, but how combinations of genes can produce effects. So, sort of co-evolutionary models, if you like. And what I want to argue, as some other people have argued, including, I think, Michael R. Beebe, is that in addition to the role of kind of gesture, that tool use, and in particular complex hierarchically structured tool manufacture, has had a really important role to play. And I want to talk about the really wonderful work that's been done by Dietrich Stout. Here you can see Dietrich Stout holding a beautiful Acheulean biface hand axe. Now, in our evolutionary history of manufacturing tools, about 2.6 million years ago, our ancestors were making these rather simple Oldowan-type stone tools. About 1.8 million years ago, our ancestors started making these early Acheulean tools. And what you can see here is there's been a bit of an increase in brain size. I'm not so sure about spherosity, but certainly an increase in brain size. And that brain size increases into the late Acheulean period. Now, many people have compared these early Acheulean tools with these late Acheulean tools and kind of pondered that over like 1 million years of human history, there didn't seem to be much change in the kind of tools being manufactured, but there was enormous change in our brains. Now, Dietrich Stout has done some wonderful work unravelling part of that mystery. What he's done is to show, by getting people to actually make these tools, is that there's an enormous amount more complexity, and in particular hierarchically structured complexity, in the manufacture of the late Acheulean tools than there is in the early Acheulean tools. Now, I'm going to kind of try and model this. In the late Acheulean tools, there was evidence of quarrying, of planning and organising and retrieving the raw material for tools. Once that was assembled, the core would be placed in the kind of hand, and different types of tools would be used for different operations on the tools. Initially, the core would be kind of shaped, it would be kind of edged by kind of going around the kind of edge. So that's one kind of hierarchical operation. Then it would be thinned. And in the thinning, this requires strikes at a particular angle to kind of flake off large chunks at the bottom of what's going to become the tool. Now, this is not something you can easily reverse engineer. It takes people a long time to acquire this kind of skill. Something that's helped considerable by kind of instruction and by error correction. And one of the really important things, it turns out, is just not to kind of happily kind of whack away, but often to use some other kinds of tools to rough out certain edges so that the kind of flaking blow won't kind of slide off, that it will release a nice kind of flake. So there's kind of loops of goal-directed behaviour going on in the manufacture of these tools. There are these preparatory strikes and kind of shape roughing up of the kind of material prior to the kind of removal of the kind of flakes. And then there's the kind of final fine thinning that goes on to produce these beautiful symmetrical late Acheulean biface tools. So what we have in the late Acheulean biface tools, but that we don't have in the early Oldowan tools, is a hierarchy of goals nested within sub-goals. And my friend and colleague, Kim Sterelny, has argued, with a bit of help from me, that this perhaps can explain two of the mysteries, or two of the things that are not fully explained by the gesture-only account for the origin of languages. First of all, those of you who know Kim Sterelny, by the way, this is not normally how he dresses. This might be the only photo in existence of Kim with a tie. Normally he wears a sweatshirt and kind of bush boots. So I happened to nab this photo of him when he was at Oxford recently and had to wear a tie. So, first of all, he observes, as lots of other people have, that if you link gesture and complex tool manufacture, you get a kind of 2-for-1 deal. The improvements in fine motor control are not only going to help you manufacturing tools, but also going to help you with elaborating kind of gestures. More importantly, I think, he suggests ways in which, through pedagogy, there might be teaching about tool manufacture, there might be the origins of context-free signals. One of the problems with kind of lots of signals is that they're tied to particular kind of stimulus. And to give an example, so I've recently been trying to teach my daughter how to play cricket. Now, cricket is probably unfamiliar to many people in this audience, but it's an enormously rich and complex game. And I've been trying to teach her recently how to play the cut shot. And a batter in cricket will normally keep their kind of eyes there, will trap the ball in the hands of the bowler, and as the ball is delivered, lift their bat up, then move, say, back if they're going to play the cut shot, and then in a striking blow, make contact with the ball, and at the point of impact, roll the wrists, and the ball would race off to the boundary down there. Now, I noticed the other day when I was trying to explain the cut shot to my daughter and trying to show why it kind of looped up and why she was caught at point, that she'd missed one critical component to that action. That in that kind of hierarchical scheme, what she'd failed to do was to kind of roll the wrists at the kind of point of contact. Now, you'll notice there that I don't need to bang my hand to kind of explain that. What Sterelny argues is these complex, hierarchically structured motor patterns are what Dick Byrne calls behavioural programs. And what we have, particularly when we're teaching, is an ability to take one component of that complex hierarchical sequence out of context, even to remove it from the stimuli that are producing it. So all I need to kind of emphasise to it now is just this. I can kind of exaggerate and ritualise that rolling of the hands kind of gesture to emphasise to roll the wrists. And then that can perhaps be elaborated. So what he argues is the ability to take offline, to take out of context elements of these complex hierarchically structured gestures might have had a really critical role to play in the teaching of tool manufacture. What about syntax? Well, one of the things you will have noticed in my rather brief and somewhat impoverished description of how to make these late Acheulean tools is there's lots of complex hierarchical structure with loops and kind of feedback. And rather briefly, this to me looks rather like this. That perhaps in the complex control of these hierarchically structured sequences, we have the origins of syntax and maybe even recursion. And the great thing about this theory is that it makes predictions. If it's true, what it should predict is that if we were to do brain imaging studies, that areas that are responsible for, say, the production of, say, language might also light up in the production of late Acheulean biface tool manufacture, but not perhaps in the manufacture of simple older one tools. And rather wonderfully, Dietrich Stout and colleagues did exactly that study. They used a PET study. Basically, their participants were injected with fluoro-2-deoxyglucose into their legs, and for 40 minutes, these people were experts in manufacturing tools. They got to make these tools. Then they were taken off into the PET scanner, and their brains were imaged. And what you can see is that when they were manufacturing their older one type tools, these regions of the brain, the premotor cortex, lit up. And they also lit up when they're manufacturing the Acheulean tools. But really interestingly, only in the case of the manufacture of the Acheulean tools did areas equivalent to Broca's area light up. So one of the really nice things about this account is that it's emphasising a much more general role for kind of Broca's area. Rather than being domain-specific to language, it seems like that it's involved in the control of hierarchically structured information. So this theory, this incremental co-evolutionary theory, a double kind of hand-to-mouth hypothesis, makes a prediction that this area should be activated, and that prediction seems to be confirmed by these recent PET imaging studies. To conclude, in the first part of this talk, I argued that a sort of key Darwinian message, really, that variation is the key, that variation is critical to understanding kind of language, and that we can understand it and how it's organised by understanding its history. And to understand its history, we can use powerful computational tools from evolutionary biology. In the final part of this talk, what I've argued is to contrast two scenarios about the origins of the language faculty. One I've argued is not at all in line with the practice of explaining evolutionary biology today. It really invokes some kind of miracle that suddenly gave us language and everything else in a big bang. The other account, kind of hand-to-mouth hypothesis, is much more in line with the kind of incremental co-evolutionary accounts of evolutionary novelty. In conclusion, what I'm saying is the time for miracles is really over. It's time to start studying the incremental evolution of cognitive abilities, including language, now. Thank you, and thanks to all the colleagues I've had a wonderful chance to work with.
Thank you. We have time for 7-8 minutes question. Question, please. One question, okay?
If you had given this talk, say, 15 years ago, about the evolution of feathers, you would have considered that was a miracle too. Maybe we are 15 years too early, for the evolution of language.
Who's the we?
The issue is what you have qualified as an outrageous postulation of miracles in the evolution of language to the biolinguist in this outrageous schema that you had there, Evo versus biolinguistic. You know, you would have had exactly the same thing 15 years ago for the evolution of feathers.
Okay, so who are the biolinguists who are looking at the kind of broad developmental role that genes might play in not only language, but other kind of faculties? Who are the biolinguists who are proposing developmental models of the origins of the language faculty? Who are the biolinguists that are proposing kind of incremental, co-opting, exaptation type kind of scenarios? I see no evidence of what I regard as the key evidence of Evo-Devo in any of the actions, in any of the behaviour of proponents of biolinguistics. And that's kind of really, frankly, why I regard it as a bit of a degenerate research program. It's just not going anywhere that's empirically kind of interesting.
Yes, I think there is information perhaps that is not out there in the talk, because I know of several work of this sort, bridging Evo-Devo and biolinguistics. There are books out to invoke the value continuity enterprise, where several work relate to this question. But I would like to mention a few studies on phylogeny studies, in fact, that go away from lexical-based phylogenies to more abstract now. One is the work from Pino Longobardi and Pino Longobardi's work on parameter. And the other one is a research project that I'm conducting, where I try to show, looking at the evolution of Indo-European languages, where there is, in very early Indo-European languages, and through the history of these languages, the earlier language, the same process that applies, that have been discussed in developmental biology, which is the fact that earlier languages tend to be, in a sense, provide more choice options, and these choices have been reduced in history. Basically, with Palmer's work on bipartite organisms that you can see in the evolution of language. How could this make sense? Well, these works on phylogeny or development tells you that the language faculty does not change. What changes is things that come from the external forces that constrains the faculty. And you can reduce that, in effect, to particular elements of the computational system. In fact, what we looked at is the emergence of preposition through all the Indo-European study languages, and we, in fact, are able to reduce that to the selection, of some feature of the grammar. So if you look at phylogeny and all sorts of things like that from item by item perspective, you have the picture that you have. If you look at it in a more relational abstract, you might come up with a different picture.
So just to give a very brief answer, I was liking everything you were saying up, I think, until the final part. So I'm familiar with some of the studies you were mentioning, and I think they're excellent. I have no disagreement whatsoever in terms of broad comparative studies of much more abstract properties of language. I think it's great. I think it's actually an interesting empirical thing to do. What I'm really against is the idea that we can understand language origins by sitting in our armchair and introspecting it as an English speaker. So I'm totally in favour of analysing real variation, and I'm keen, even at its quite abstract levels. What I don't accept is the kind of final conclusion that what this shows is that it's kind of all wide in there. Those studies that I looked at, the ones you mentioned, I don't think really support that claim. But we can disagree, we can talk about that afterwards.
you. I'm originally a developmental biologist, and I have some idea of the eye-body things, and also I'm recently working on the autism animal model as well. So in my view, you showed that all the genes are almost nothing in your list, but I think that the hint would be coming from the study of the autism people, because it's not has a language problem, but also they have a minor motor sign as well. So which means that a kind of the gesture problem and also the language problem should also be some the model in not a normal way, but from the abnormality can tell the future the knowledge. That's what you think about that.
I'm not quite sure I completely followed, but if you're saying that we need to understand the kind of genetic basis of fine motor control and hierarchically constructed motor control, that might tell us a lot about language, or might be part of an understanding of language, then I agree. Did I get the kind of crux of the question? So yes, I totally agree.
Okay, well, so I have a question. Can you go back to the tree diagram?
Which one? The
Yeah. Well, no, the later.
no.
Contrasting yeah, this one. Okay. I see that the syntactic processing is asymmetry, but the tool making could be very symmetrical. So this is a very big difference, isn't it?
So you mean the kind of flow diagram? The bit at the top is quarrying. Like it's not likely that they start making the tool, they quarry, they bring the tools, and then they go back again. So I think that just the initial point there is asymmetrical, but there is symmetrical kind of loops in terms of the preparatory kind of strikes that are done on the kind of surface, and this kind of feedback. Like if things go wrong, skilled manufacturers of these tools can then correct the kind of structure. So I think there is much more similarity there than there are kind of differences.
I think asymmetry is more important than symmetry.
Sorry?
Asymmetry.
Asymmetry.
Asymmetry. More important than symmetry in human syntax.
What, because of like centered embedded kind of recursion and things?
So, the person in the back. And this will be the last question.
So as a computational model, I cannot be watching a brief explanation for your beautiful work on the computational reconstruction of physical tree. But I'm also thinking we have a tradition of agent-based modeling, or reviewing-based individual behavior theories, whereas in your model it seems to be a much more simpler model of what happens in the tree. Do you think it would be possible to combine both approaches in a computationally feasible way? You have to think about that.
No, I love that suggestion. I think it's really fascinating. I mean, one of the things that we've really done is just focus on sort of our language group is sort of like macroevolutionary studies, really. And what evolutionary biologists want to do is be able to link kind of microevolution to kind of macroevolution. So I think one of the sort of really interesting themes that's been coming out of this conference is the idea that the really important role of kind of iterated kind of learning. So I can imagine kind of models of perhaps agent-based models of iterated learning, and you might see how they produce certain kind of generalities, and you might be able to see whether those kind of processes writ large produce the kind of macroscopic patterns that we see in the diversity of the world's language. So in biology, there's coalescent theory, which links kind of microevolution through to kind of macroevolution. What I think we kind of need is the linguistic equivalent of kind of coalescent theory. So I think that's a really interesting and productive future line of inquiry.
Okay, thank you very much.